So hello and welcome to another episode of TopTenz. I'm your interim host for this episode, Karl Smallwood. Yes, that is my real name and this is my new setup. Thank you for being patient with me. And today we're talking about 10 bizarre weapons designed during World War II. There are a few better motivators for progress than war, except perhaps a world war, because that's like so much more war, and thus resources have been dedicated to figuring out new and indeed creative ways to explode people into clouds of gore and viscera. But here's the thing, if you're throwing a bunch of ideas against a wall to see what sticks, some of those ideas are going to fall on the ground and get forgotten about, only to be picked up several decades later and used as fodder in an occasionally entertaining and hopefully educational YouTube series hosted by me. And before we move on, there's an editor's note here. Spoilers, I was the editor. I thought Eric would be doing this one, but I'll read out my own editor's note. How meta. This is a video about World War II, so we expect a lot of, well, actually guys with World War II themed avatars in the comments. So it's worth noting that to make videos entertaining as well as informative for a general audience, some details of things have been truncated for the sake of brevity. So if we do get minor details wrong or gloss over things, that's the reason why, although we'd never not discourage people from commenting below, so like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Let's get on with the video. Number 10, the A-13 Mark III, aka the Covenanter. When the first tanks rumbled onto the battlefield during World War I, their arrival kickstarted a literal arms race to create bigger and better examples of the technology, and World War II saw the culmination of these efforts play out, often to devastating effect. Now, while World War II saw a wide variety of tank designs introduced and used, invariably the focus of the major players during the war was to give them thicker armour and bigger guns. For example, consider the formidable Soviet KV heavy tank, which was reportedly so massive and impervious to conventional weapons of the day that in one notable battle, the drivers, upon being shot at by dedicated anti-tank guns, simply trundled towards them as the rounds harmlessly pinged off the chassis and then ran them over. They literally just ran over the anti-tank guns with their tanks. Then you have the A-13 Mark III, hereafter referred to by the easier to say out loud Covenanter, for which the designers took, shall we say, a different approach. For starters, the people making the Covenanter, London, Midland and Scottish Railway Company, had no experience manufacturing weaponry, having previously made, as you have probably guessed from their name, trains. Fortunately, the company didn't have to design and build a tank from scratch, instead being asked to improve upon the design of an existing tank, which they did by fitting a bigger engine, which makes sense. A bigger engine means the tank will go faster and get to Berlin even quicker. Hooray, British ingenuity. The problem was that this bigger engine didn't really fit, which the designers addressed by removing the tank's cooling systems, an inspired decision that made the inside super comfy and warm for the crew, which was doubly ensured by removing much of the tank's ventilation. Now, while we're obviously being sarcastic here, this potentially could have been fine, if a little uncomfortable, if the tank was designated for service in a cold environment. It wasn't like this would be the first piece of military hardware built with efficiency rather than comfort in mind. The thing is though, this thing was intended for use in Africa. Unsurprisingly, the tank that occasionally overheated in the UK, a place where, fun fact, we sell in excess of 8 bottles of sunscreen per year, the tank overheated all the time in Africa. And the tank was deemed to be useless. Like, literally, as in, not a single one of these things ever fired a single shot in combat, despite some 1,700 being made. Moving on. Number 9, dummy paratroopers. Deception was a big part of the Allied plan for the Normandy invasion, or D-Day as it's better known, and the war effort as a whole. Examples of the kind of subterfuge the Allies engaged in included, but wasn't limited to, the creation of an entire fake army of cardboard cutouts, colloquially known as, rather awesomely, the Ghost Army, to fool Hitler into thinking the Allied invasion force was much bigger than it actually was. And then you have a plan that involved dropping a dead guy into the ocean wearing a military uniform, carrying dummy papers sporting details of a non-existent military maneuver, then just sort of pushing him towards Germany. If you think that last one sounds like something right out of a spy movie, you'd actually be kind of right, since the initial idea was proposed by none other than Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond. Then you have the Rupert dummy paratroopers, designed with the intention of fooling Germans into thinking the D-Day invasion was happening somewhere else, mainly inland. The dummy paratroopers were made of burlap and then stuffed with sand. Standing and imposing 3 feet tall, these sandy soldiers would be hurled from planes over strategic locations, mainly anywhere D-Day wasn't actually happening. But That wasn't the only part of deception, because some of the dummies were rigged to explode on impact to baffle and confuse German troops, as well as dispose of any evidence that they even existed in the first place. Plus, we can't imagine it hurt to have at least some Germans think that Allied paratroopers had the ability to detonate themselves at will. For any German soldiers bold enough to investigate, they'd encounter only smoke, sand, and several highly trained and very pissed off SAS commandos. You see, the final part of this plan was to pepper a couple of real paratroopers in with the dummy ones, to play the sound of gunfire and marching when they landed, to lure soldiers in and then ambush them. Number 8, the V3 Super Cannon. Anybody who spent any amount of time online just consuming content about World War II, like this video, or anyone who's played Call of Duty, the Nazi Zombies mode, is likely familiar with the idea of Wunderwaffe, literally wonder weapons. But for the uninitiated, during World War II, the Nazis invested a not insignificant amount of resource into coming up with weapons and technology to turn the tide of the war. These literal Nazi super weapons, for the most part, had little material impact on the war, largely due to the fact few made it off the drawing board, and fewer still were built in appreciable enough numbers to tip the scales in Hitler's favour. Examples of Wunderwaffe that never saw the light of day, but are nonetheless interesting to read and theorise about the potential impact they could have had on the war, include a 1,000-ton tank, ironically given the designation of Rat, a giant glider made of wood given the designation Mammoth, which is more fitting, and a plane with no weaponry of any kind, designed to literally be flown directly into enemy aircraft. For that one, they seemingly gave up on trying to come up with a cool nickname, dubbing it simply the Ramjager, literally the Rammer. Perhaps the most ambitious, though, was the now this is a German-ass German word, the Vergeltungswaffe number 3, literally the vengeance weapon, sometimes called the England gun, or more simply still, the V3 cannon. For anyone curious about the naming here, literally the only thing this thing was designed to do would be shell the ever-loving shit out of England from France. To this end, the guns couldn't be aimed. They were literally built into the side of a hill in France by slave labourers and pointed squarely and permanently at London. Fortunately, German engineers couldn't quite figure out how to get the gun to fire, since it relied upon an experimental multi-charge system. Essentially, to get the projectiles the gun was designed to fire to, well, actually leave the barrel, several charges had to be detonated at designated points along the several 100-foot-long barrel and at precisely the right time. The Germans never really got this system to work, only firing a handful of projectiles during the war, none of which ever reached the limits of the proposed range of about 100 miles, so London was safe. Eventually, the whole thing was scrapped, literally due to a lack of time and resources. Number 7, bat bombs. Animals have frequently been deployed in warfare, serving in a variety of roles. Some expected, others not so much. And yes, before anyone comments, we are aware of Wojtek, the Polish cavalry bear. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I did ask my Polish friend to weigh in, and they said, "Karl, I'm busy. Get a real job." But as useful as Wojtek undoubtedly was on the battlefield, he could only maul one German soldier at a time, which is just inefficient. If only there was a way to make him, and indeed any other animal utilised in warfare, randomly burst into flames. Wouldn't that be useful? Well, this was basically the idea behind bat bombs, the brainchild of a, if it wasn't obvious, bat-hating dentist called Little Adams, who suggested attaching tiny incendiary bombs to bats and then literally airdropping them on Japanese cities. The idea being that the bats would crawl into the woodwork of Japanese homes, at which point they'd explode and burn down whatever house they were in. Japanese homes at the time being largely made of wood and very susceptible to being set on fire. To be clear, when we say this idea was born out of Adams's dislike of bats, that's not a joke or us being facetious. Adams opined that the bat is, and I quote, the lowest form of life, and he argued they had no reason to exist that he could think of, making them the ideal fodder for such a plan. At this point, we think Adams was just shit on by a bat as a child and managed to convince the president to strap napalm to them, because, oh yeah, President Roosevelt loved this idea and tasked the military with figuring it out somehow. What makes this particular idea so fascinating, though, is just how far along it got, despite numerous obvious issues that would arise from strapping bombs to wild animals, like the bats being too small to carry enough napalm to do any real damage to a home, something the military realised would be a problem when an early test resulted in every bat they dropped falling to the ground and exploding. Here's the thing though, they managed to figure that out, and they solved it by just adding more bats. Then you had the issue of the bats gnawing on the bombs during transit, since the bombs had to be attached in advance with glue, something they solved by putting the bats into ice cube trays and freezing them. No, I'm not making that up. Arguably the biggest issue though was that these were wild animals and it's not like they could be trained. Again, this was an issue they solved by just throwing more bats at it. However, the whole thing fell apart when a bunch of the bats escaped and it immediately flew to a nearby hangar and burned it down. A visiting general's car was also reportedly set ablaze, presumably by a hero bat who wanted revenge. Number 6. Project Habakkuk. It's a common joke that it makes no real sense how a battleship made of steel weighing hundreds and hundreds of tons is able to float. Like, we understand why they're able to do this, but it doesn't stop it being weird. This was no doubt the thought process of one Jeffrey Pike when he came up with the idea of making a ship out of a material that made more sense. Ice, because ice floats. Well, technically, ice and wood mixed together in a very specific quantity. For the curious, the usual ratio is 15% wood, 85% water, to create a material known as pykrete, named after Jeffrey Pike. Despite sounding quite flimsy, especially compared to something like, military-grade steel, pykrete is remarkably tough and, more importantly, very cheap, since all you really need to make is a steady supply of wood, water, and the ability to freeze the two. So moving back to the plan, the idea was to create a floating aircraft carrier out of the material that would be effectively impervious to enemy fire and easily repaired with a resource found in virtually unlimited quantities on the high seas: salt water. But we know what you're thinking. Surely it would melt or something, right? Well, kind of, but it would take a really, really long time due to its size, with one example lasting 3 summers in Canada, I think. The fact that the sea was quite cold and the ability of seamen to repair and patch it on the fly meant that it could last even longer. Hell, even if the sea was close to scalding, a carrier made of pykrete would probably be just fine, something Jeffrey Pike proved to none other than Winston Churchill. Supposedly by dropping a brick made of the stuff into the Prime Minister's bathwater, the Prime Minister would frequently take meetings while he was bathing, prompting a bemused Churchill to play with the brick like a toy while Pike explained his plan to him. Sadly for all the pykrete boys and gals out there, the idea never materialised, simply because advancing radar and plane technology made the whole thing obsolete. Not to mention that while the material to make pykrete was inexpensive and plentiful, the refrigeration needed would have literally required more steel than it would have taken to just build a ship. So it was a no-go. Number 5, the Bob Semple tank. Remember we talked about how Britain tasked a company who'd never made a tank to make a tank? Of course you do. You've got a great memory and are very handsome. We really do appreciate that about you. That was kind of stupid, right? Well, New Zealand did one better and had a random government official who had no idea what a tank even was design a tank. We think it's not really clear what the guy was going for. If you asked a 5-year-old to draw a tank, gave that to an engineer and asked them to use that as a basis for building a tank, it would probably end up looking better and be more functional than this thing was. Called the Bob Semple tank after its inventor, Bob Semple, the tank was born out of the fear that Japan might invade New Zealand and the country wouldn't be able to defend itself. Standing a staggering 12 feet tall, the tank was made of that hardiest of materials, corrugated iron, the stuff they use to make roofs that is occasionally dented by birds flying into it. Okay, so they did use a lot of corrugated iron, which made the tank quite hardy, but this adversely impacted both its top speed and its manoeuvrability, to the point some prototypes literally just fell over. On top of this, the tank also clocked in at 25 tons of fun, a weight that meant it couldn't drive on any bridge in New Zealand without causing it to collapse. As for armaments, New Zealand wasn't exactly swimming in big guns. They compromised by shoving 6 machine guns inside of it and pointed them out awkwardly at different angles from jagged holes like hurriedly cut into the iron. Because New Zealand was never invaded, the tanks never saw combat, so how effective they would have been isn't clear, though experts have suggested that they may have done quite well as a defensive countermeasure, simply because most people can't look at one without collapsing in a fit of laughter. Moving on. Number 4, anti-tank dogs. Chances are a lot of the people watching this are already familiar with the tale, pun obviously intended, of Soviet anti-tank dogs. But if we didn't mention it here, at some point there'd be no doubt a bunch of people in the comments asking why we didn't, so let's talk about exploding dogs for a moment, shall we? Similar to the aforementioned bat bombs, the idea behind anti-tank dogs was as simple as it was dickish towards the dogs involved. Strap a bomb to a dog and command it to take cover beneath an enemy tank before detonating it. Problem solved. While absurd on the surface, the idea wasn't without merit. Dogs are small and nimble enough to dart about the battlefield in relative safety, at least compared to a human, easily trainable, and putting it rather bluntly, an easily replenished and exploitable resource. It's not nice to talk about dogs like that, but this is war we're talking about. Which is probably why the Soviets were so convinced the idea would work and spent so much time, so much money, and so many resources training a veritable army of detonating doggos. Though it would seem they trained them a little too well. You see, the Soviets trained the dogs using their own tanks, since that's all they had available, which caused many of the dogs to immediately run towards and detonate beneath friendly tanks upon being deployed, which is true in the story you've probably heard online, but it's not the whole story. To explain, many sources online talking about this story like to suggest that the Soviets training the dogs using their own tanks was a bad idea, and that's the reason that it was abandoned. But the Soviets' reasoning was pretty sound and makes sense. The type of tank didn't really matter to the dogs. It's not like they'd be able to tell the difference between a KV-2 and a Panzer. They didn't have a War Thunder subscription or anything like that. The real problem is that the Soviets trained dogs on stationary tanks, that the dogs weren't accustomed to the noise and din of the battlefield, which resulted in many of them immediately flipping their shit on the battlefield and jumping back into the arms of their handler, at which point they'd explode. For the handful of dogs that were trained on moving tanks, there was still a pretty major issue no human would notice, and no source talking about this in a general fashion ever seems to take into account. The smell. Specifically the smell of diesel, the fuel many Soviet tanks used, and was the primary thing the dogs used to zero in on their targets. Like, the dogs didn't know what type of tank they were looking at. They just saw a big metal monstrosity that they were commanded to run towards. They identified it using the smell. And it wasn't until I researched this that I went, yeah, that does make sense. Why did I think that the dogs would recognise the type of tank? Why is it always framed like that? The dogs don't care. The dogs don't know. They just see a big metal oblong and run towards it. Anyway, getting back to the scripts, when the dogs were commanded to seek out a tank and lie beneath it, they quite literally followed their nose to the nearest thing they recognised. A friendly tank with diesel fumes, at which point they'd hide underneath and promptly explode. Number 3, the Panjan drum. The Panjan drum was an experimental weapon designed by the British to breach the formidable Atlantic Wall, a German coastal defence system running all the way from Norway to Spain. But how would one get through a giant wall covered with machine guns and Nazis? If your answer is to strap a bunch of rockets to a giant metal wheel, point it at Hitler and then let physics take care of the rest, you're exactly the right kind of crazy to work for, and I'm not making this up, the Department of Miscellaneous Weapon Developments during World War II, which, can I just say, is like the most British name for an experimental weapons division I've ever heard. Anyway, the idea was as simple as it was ballsy, and our description of how it worked isn't hyperbole or exaggerated in any real way. It really was just a big set of wheels covered in rockets designed to be pointed at the Nazis. The benefit of such a design being that it could fire from the ocean, minimising the risk to Allied troops and maximising the risk to the Germans. The downsides were, well, everything else about it. For one, it couldn't really be aimed. Like, you could point it in a direction, it would sort of fly towards it, but any bump or divot would cause it to fly wildly off course, many of which you will find on a bombed out battlefield. Something I feel they could have spun as a positive, because that does sound kind of terrifying for the people it's flying towards, if not for a second issue, that the rockets powering it would occasionally fall off and almost hit the people firing it. The weapon never really got out of the testing phase, with one disastrous test almost hitting a cameraman tasked with filming it. Number 2, exploding rats. So we've covered a couple of weaponized animals in this video, but this one is actually genius, and it did actually work. Now, the image you probably have in your mind from the title of this one is a bunch of rats with bombs strapped to them and let loose in the city like the Pied Piper if you just locked in. But the reality is far more subtle and something only an absolute madman would have come up with. Thought up by, and I quote, the boffins working for the Special Operations Executive, essentially a shadowy British agency tasked with, among other things, helping the various resistance groups sticking it to Hitler, and I quote, set Europe ablaze. To this end, the SOE invented a number of improvised bombs and weaponry such groups or secret agents could use to sow discord and disharmony abroad, including a hand grenade that, like a sugar beet, a tyre pump with a bomb in it, the idea being to let down enemies' tyres and then leave the device nearby, and a pair of shoes that left footprints that made you look Japanese. If anyone curious how that worked, they just put the footprint of a Japanese person below, so in case you were like sneaking in. And it sounds stupid, but these are the kind of things secret agents have to take into account. However, the most ingenious device was arguably the simplest. A dead rat with a bomb shoved just inside. That's going to be a gif, I can already see it. So what makes this device so clever, you ask? Well, it's not really the idea that's smart, but the plan of where to implement it. Anywhere with a furnace. You see, the idea would be to sneak in the dead, explosive-laden rat into a place with a coal furnace, like a factory or a train, and then just wait. Because the Allies knew. They knew that no worker, upon finding a dead rat, when a furnace is nearby, would dispose of it properly. No, they would do what anyone would in that situation. They would pick up the dead rat and throw it directly into the furnace, at which point, rat explosion, factory crippled, day ruined, job done. But it gets better, because while these incendiary rodents were never used as intended, they did still cause a massive headache for the Germans. How, you ask? Well, it's reported that German morale was utterly crushed when a group of them intercepted a shipment of dead rats earmarked for being shoved full of dynamite, and realised they basically at that point had to seek out every rat in a mile-wide radius and kill it, because if they didn't, one might explode and kill them all. Finally, number 1, the Who Me stink bomb. This final weapon is far from the most destructive one listed so far, but if it was ever implemented successfully, it is no exaggeration that it could have quite literally turned the tide of the war. That is because it completely and utterly decimated something no army could fight without: morale. Funded by the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, the Who Me bomb was designed by chemical engineer Ernest Crocker, a guy who'd cut his teeth during World War I, helping refine and deadlify various chemical weapons and poison gases. The Who Me bomb was envisioned as basically a giant stink bomb, which doesn't sound too threatening, right? But keep in mind, this wasn't a regular stink bomb. This was the ultimate stink bomb, a bomb designed to release the most chemically abhorrent smell imaginable. A smell so bad it would never wash out and leave any area it was released in unlivable for days, if not weeks or months. So why wasn't this weapon ever used? Well, ironically, Crocker did too good of a job, and the smell was so potent there was quite literally no way to package it without some of it leaking out and contaminating the entire area, which, remember, would render it almost uninhabitable for weeks, if not months. And another thing is, just no one wanted to work on this thing. Like, all the factories making this stuff, just no one wanted to work there. But it's no exaggeration that if there was ever a way discovered to safely package that smell, the applications would have been near endless, and the impact on German morale, catastrophic. Because let's be honest here, it would have been really, really difficult for the Nazis to swan around proclaiming themselves to be the master race when they all smelled like shit. So thank you for tuning in to this episode of Top Tens. I've been your host, Karl Smallwood. As mentioned in the intro, if you do have any feedback, comments, suggestions like that, you can leave them in the comments section below. You can like if you like the video, comment if you've got anything to say, subscribe for more content like this, and as always, go out there and have the day that you deserve. Also, maybe some feedback on my new setup. I was moving. I don't know if anyone did, if anyone missed me, I was moving. This is my new house. I don't have an office anymore because I didn't want 70% of my living space to be workspace or it to be living space, so it's a bit smaller, a bit more compact, a bit more intimate. But yeah, feedback would be greatly appreciated and taken on board, to the extent that I would be able to anyway. Cheers everybody, have a great day.